These are the issues I will deal with today, starting with the role of equilibrium and going on to the Schön's perspective on the long run with the waves and cycles, and some concepts and issues within the long run, and also a crucial issue about equilibrium economics is the role of shocks. So we'll take a case study of a shock and how Schön dealt with that. And finally, a few selective, I suppose, efforts to generalize on Schön's approach. So this is a magnum opus of Schön. In the English edition, as you see here, it came first in Swedish in year 2000, and it was later translated to English. And I would also draw your attention to a review of this book in Historisk Tidskrift, unfortunately just in Swedish, by the professor in Gothenburg, Lars Herlitz. He passed away actually before it came in print, this review, so it was his final work by Herlitz, and he put Schön's works into the field of economic history in Sweden, and actually he placed Schön at level with, in some aspects, even ahead of Heckscher. And he also points to some problems within the approach of Schön, which I can just touch upon here, but maybe the discussion will come to some of those. There was also a book planned as a festschrift for Lennart, but as he passed away, it was changed to book in memory. So I can have 2 copies here and circulate it. And I will draw on the introductory chapter in this book. I circled the structural analysis here because that was the approach which Lennart used, and structural analysis emerged in, maybe Åkerman used it, and the Åkerman was a predecessor in a very similar approach, and Schön and others in this department learned a lot from Åkerman, and so the concept of structural analysis emanates from Åkerman. Otherwise, it's mostly used in physics, I suppose. So why not equilibrium? In mainstream economics, the way of explanation is often to look at the development as this, as equilibrium, and then comes a shock, and then there's a return from the shock. This is applied in several models. However, it's that we are in equilibrium here, and that it's just the fluctuations are just a random walk, is based on assumption. And further, it's an assumption that the shock is exogenous. And the question is what happens if it's actually is endogenous. And if it doesn't return to equilibrium and there is a structural change, so the equilibrium thinking will not apply. And the answer to this is that the context differs over time and space, and we don't know exactly how if we don't take a wider perspective. And the wider perspective are not always applied by economists who use hypothesis testing, and they have a hypothesis and they test if it works. So they don't observe the animals outside the light of the lamppost. So what we need to do is to take account of change over time. So, and I would say that what you see here is not a complete consensus, but there is a quite broad agreement on this historical narrative. And I have to fill in that it's not about the variations in economic growth, but it's different characteristics of the development in this cyclical or wave-like pattern. And what we have here in the first wave is the first industrial revolution with the steam engine as a very important technology. We have the innovation wave of the second industrial revolution with the combustion engine and electricity as crucial. And we have the third industrial revolution based on the very much on the microprocessor. So the question is, why is this important for explanation? So we take a further look at how Schön decomposed this innovation wave. And there is two cycles within the innovation wave, and he called them structural cycles. And during an innovation wave, the first structural cycle is centered on original innovations, whereas the second structural cycle is when those innovations are becoming more pervasive, coming into infrastructure of the society. And if we look at the 19th century, which we have here, so the characteristic of the first structural innovation cycle was that it was very much focused on domestic markets, whereas the infrastructure was also connected to expansion of exports. So why then further decomposing the cycles? We decompose the structural cycle, and there are two different periods: the transformation and the rationalization. And I will further explain why there is these different characteristics. So the transformation starts from a crisis, notably a structural crisis, and there are the crisis is enhancing, promoting the diffusion of innovations that might have been developed before, but hasn't taken off. they are given the opportunity to diffuse in the crisis for different reasons, and they are giving rise to new development blocks. And the development blocks are could also be seen in new industries, and we can also call this whole for structural change. However, the development blocks, they mature and become old, and this happens in the rationalization phase, and it comes a new structural crisis here after the rationalization. A key factor in these different phases are the character of and composition of investments. So investments during the transformation phase is directed towards renewal, and they could also be seen in a relatively larger part of construction compared to machinery investments, whereas in the rationalization phase, the investments are directed towards efficiency, and in the relation between machinery investment and construction investment, the machinery is taking a relatively larger share. So now I go to some of those concepts and problems related to the long cycles. And one is the development block. Development block is characterized by complementarity between different activities. And we have, for example, the pharmaceutical industry and hospitals. And this also means that there could well be, often have been development blocks bridging the business sector and the public sector, as in this case. And also when it comes to electricity, with the electrical engineering industry, power stations and the electrical grid, which are also over institutional sectors. And there are several other development blocks through history, as you can imagine. And the development blocks are crucial in explaining this time pattern of the cycles, which are, the structural cycles are about 40 years long. So the reason for is in the development blocks, because these typically have life cycle. They emerge from an innovation, they grow as an industry and becoming part of the infrastructure. And another important trace of the development block is that originally, when they are emerging, they are flexible, but with time they change this property and becomes often rigid and difficult to change, but nevertheless are in need for a transformation. And as examples of this need for transformation, we can see in the 1970s with a structural crisis where steel was a big part of the crisis for the Swedish steel industry. It succeeded to renew and come back rather quickly, and it was through innovation and also cost cutting, but in the main it was through innovation. Another case, the opposite case, is shipbuilding, which was also in the center of the structural crisis, but which in Sweden, for different reasons, did not innovate and didn't succeed to survive. So it was more or less closed. It was the big part of the industry was closed down. And one could notice that the concept of development block was coined by Erik Dahmén already in 1942, and he came back to this and used the concept in several publications. Joseph here has a chapter in the book circulating here, focusing on development blocks, which is warmly recommended for reading. And it's interesting to note that there are much similar concepts in the literature around. Strikingly, GPTs have big similarities, and Lennart also used GPT in some of his publications. However, one could say that a development block, not only few development block, becomes a GPT, because the GPT is more, it should be pervasive in the economy, and that typically applies to the infrastructural cycle, the second structural cycle, when the innovations are becoming more pervasive, that have similarities with the GPT. And it also worth to note, I think, that the GPT could be seen as a way of originally neoclassical economists, like not the, for example, Lipsy, as an effort from neoclassical economists to combine with the more Schumpeterian thinking. But there are several other similar concepts. For example, Carlota Perez' techno-economic paradox. But there is an important and crucial difference between Perez and Schön, and that I would say is that Schön, as I will show in a while, is based himself on a quantitative analysis of well-defined data, whereas Carlota Perez has a more intuitive approach. And I would say that all these, the occurrence of these different concepts, to my perception, reflects that there is something out there in economy and society which we intuitively could perceive, but there are very few more precise methodologies for methods to define and describe them. But I think that Schön has come very close to a more precise method. So I just go over how the different, because different innovation waves have developed in Sweden. You know this from the, at least if you have read Schön's book, that in the second industrial revolution, where first centering on engineering, steel and the consumption industries. Later in the infrastructural part of the cycle, the infrastructural cycle, it was electrification broadly, it was the car industry, it was shipbuilding, and then we have the third industrial revolution with the decline of manufacturing. However, it's often talked about decline of manufacturing, but it's just the employment that has declined. The output has continuously grown. At the same time, growth of services, both in employment and output. And in the infrastructural phase, we could expect, or hopefully expect, I would say, more innovation and more pervasive systems for energy generation and the fossil-free transport, nanotechnologies. If I should talk more freely on my part, I think that comparing with Robert Gordon, who thinks that all big innovations are behind, for example, the sewage systems and water supply and such things. I think that we still have a lot to do in the sewage systems and water supply, because it's totally crazy to have fresh water, drinking water in the toilets and so on. So there are opportunities, but still whether this will realize or happen is depending on actors. And this was also something that was emphasized by Lennart Schön, that all these cycles were not just deterministic, but they were dependent on actors. And this leads further to the question about institutions and institutional change, because this is also part of his model of the structural cycles, where the transformation phases are connected with the institutional change, whereas the rationalization typically are connected with institutional stability. And if we stay in the 19th century, we can see that how important institutions changing in the transformation period here, with the freedom of print and speech, and the system with king and diet. Again, in the transformation phase here, we have the liberalization of business in several reforms, and also the parliamentary reform with the diet change to a more modern parliament. And these changes were prompted by transformations, by large changes in the economy and society, which prompted institutional change. However, this is not to say that all institutional change is achieving optimal solutions. And Schön, for example, emphasized that in the very broad perspective, the First World War was the outcome of a failure to find institutional solution for the need for international integration in the development of, as you know, the first wave of globalization and all that. I could add, and at another occasion I will develop why the institutional change of following the structural crisis in the 1970s took a turn that was not very fortunate, with a neoliberal shift that occurred, and where we now face a lot of difficulties. By Schön emphasized several times when he pointed to that through history, infrastructure had been part of the government intervention very much. But when we should introduce network systems of different sorts, there was the government left its hand outside, which created problems. I could just mention EP only. So, leaving that and coming to the issue of periodization, I will point to the investments. This is a graph from the book by Schön, and you see I fill in red the investment ratio in manufacturing, and if you find the lower troughs in this, there are high volatility in the series, but the lowest troughs are coming in the structural crisis. So investment ratio was down in this period, and if you go to his book, you will find that there were different trends. The maxima were in the change between transformation and rationalization. And this also leads to, which I shortly mentioned before, that Schön worked, he derived his whole model not from theoretical, from the international literature on long waves, but his starting point was the historical national accounts, which was a project in the 1980s in this department. And the generalization from this is that I would say that very much is for in the Swedish context, but what is general in this structural cycle model, I think, is the transformation and rationalization phases, which are applied to different characteristics of the economic development. And a key for understanding, as I said before, of the development block. However, going further into this, if there are more evidence for transformation and rationalization, what I showed before were this periodization, which could be seen in the investment cycle, but the different differences in character between transformation and rationalization, how could we discern those? One aspect is the labor productivity. If we decompose labor productivity into the productivity related to productivity change, related to within sectors, and reallocation or structural change, which means movement of resources between sectors or movement of labor between sectors. And as you see here, in the first, it's the second industrial revolution starting here. In this period, in this structural cycle, it's rather constant productivity change, but the relations between the reallocation part and the within sectoral part is quite different. So you see in the transformation phase, it's much larger part which is due to reallocation. And we could see a similar thing in from the 30s to the 70s, where the productivity change is much higher in the rationalization period, but the relation between the reallocation and the within sectoral change is different between the periods. Just as before, much higher is due contribution from relatively seen is from structural change in the transformation phase. And in the next cycle, we have a similar pattern. I have added this on base, the bottom line here, because you can see in the source. You can see the sources down here. And we have the same pattern coming back. This is one of the indicators used by Schön. So now I come to the case of shock, whether the oil crisis was endogenous or exogenous. And in the 70s, there were several crises occurring. We had the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. We had the oil crisis and the structural crisis in steel and so on. There was, I have symbolized this. This ship was built in the now fashionable housing area in Malmö, Västerhamnen, in Malmö, on the Kockums shipyard in the mid-70s. And it can symbolize the quadrupling of fourfold increase of oil prices in the winter 73, 74. And the mainstream assumptions here is that it was an exogenous shock, it was OPEC just high in prices, and it caused the crisis of the 70s. Schön is, I would say, he's not usually used such definite words, but in this case, he completely disagreed and wrote that it was such assumptions are unreasonable. And he wrote also that it was more logical to see it as a structural change in the post-war economic structure. And that the growth had reached, had created new conditions that couldn't be sustained any longer, and that the oil price shock was an outcome of one thing was the Vietnam War and the role of the East is also involved in this discussion, but you can find the more full text on page 280 in his book. But he pointed to the important changes, and he further. This is a citation from that page, but he also had a long argument that if there hadn't the stability had continued which existed in the 50s and 60s. Then the price increases of oil could easily have been absorbed. And there were, for example, investments boom both in Sweden, which he mentions, or also Japan had, for example, big plans for investments in the old sectors of industry in the early 70s. But due to the structural crisis, it was not possible to go ahead with this, and therefore came other complications. I could point to it's a broad brush painting here, but there's a lot of content in it. For example, the quickly change the system for capital movements as a consequence of these developments in the early 70s. Usually this is connected to the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, but as was nicely shown by Eduardo Altamura in a dissertation in 2016, the rise of the capital movements, the financialization of the Western economy was very much connected to the circulation of the petrodollars, the income which came to the OPEC countries and then were recirculated to Western, also developing countries. So I'm coming to conclusion from this reflections on Schön. And one thing is that exploration is a necessary part of explanation. And I have put a quote here. It's not fully accurate, but this was the content that Lennart several times in our discussions emphasized, that because it's often said that it's just a description. It's not as valuable as full-fledged explanation. But his thought was that the description is a good part of an explanation. And also another conclusion is that the context differs between structural periods, and the innovation waves and structural cycles show this on the more macro level. But we should also remember that there are changes on the lower levels of the economy that we not can be sure on beforehand, and that's why one should be careful to apply the equilibrium thinking also outside this longer term. And structure means stable relations, and therefore it's important to study the relations between and to do this quantitatively means to focus on very often to focus on ratios between variables. So not growth as for example, growth is not the most important to explain the larger picture, but there are different ratios, investment ratio, for example, the ratio between productivity change within sectors and due to reallocation, and so on and so on. Thank you.
So we usually repeat questions for 20 minutes. It can be earlier if you have to leave at 3, of course. Is there any questions?
Yes, what is the most appropriate level of analysis in Schön's framework? Is it macro level, or could you also think of using this framework and ideas at sort of meso level, micro level? Would it make sense to do that?
Yeah, I think so. Much of his work was on the meso level, I would say.
What is the meso level here?
It would be industries and in some cases, or going down to a more micro level could include companies, business firms, and so on. But nevertheless, I think the Lennart often emphasized that it was the macro level, the big picture, was always important. But to explain it, it's sometimes necessary to go down and make even micro investigations. For example, for my part, I began with micro data for contributing with deflators to the historical national accounts. So the collection of prices for individual commodities and building up to a macro picture of the prices. So.
I have 2 questions. So on the point that you just brought now of price, I was curious if you could say more about the role of price cycle in this model and how it can interact to explain the cycles of the structural development block. And my other question is, in the context of financialization, neoliberalization, maybe the role of investment change. So it's so important to drive these blocks. And I was curious if you can comment on this, on the role of investment and maybe speculation and the distinction between the two.
Yeah, to the first issue about the prices and actually I had pictures on that, but I found it's not in Lennart's, so but works directly, so I didn't use it here. But there's, I think, very clear evidence for this patterns of the structural cycles in the relative prices. Again, the ratios between prices of for example, new products related to the general index of manufacturers. And this shows the most clear could be the machinery investment, machinery prices, which have until the 70s have this pattern of the structural cycles. After that, machinery is no longer a typical innovative product, and it has rising prices. Otherwise, innovative products have typically falling prices, in particular in transformation periods. So, and when it comes to investments, they are connected also to the occurrence of crisis in between the structural crisis. So there are what Schön called the transformation crisis and culmination crisis, which are due to very successful transformation, leading to more investments and over-investments, which shows up in leads to a transformation crisis, very much in the financial sector, and also the culmination crisis in part of the rationalization period is much in the finance. For example, the dot-com crisis around the 2000 was what he classified as a culmination crisis. And the differences between structural crisis and the other crisis could more intuitively be said as the structural crisis is the solution of the structural crisis calls for new direction of development, whereas the culmination or transformation crisis are broadly going on in the same direction. So more of the same.
And we also have a Kirk comment. So,
do you think that this structural pattern, the transformation, can be applied to the period before the industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution? Or do you think it starts there?
Just like Schumpeter and Kondratiev began in the Napoleonic Wars with the long wave. So Schön is also starting in the very late 18th century, where I think the mechanism of investments and the role of the markets were more limited in the period before.
Would it need to be like applied to other sectors than technology and industry, like the rise of the banking sector and financialization, financial markets in the 17th century in England? Could that be applied to the same wave structure?
It's a difficult issue. One could, I think that the research program here is not to find the same pattern everywhere, but to look for the mechanisms. And if the mechanisms are this with transformation and rationalization are the same in other periods and in other sectors. So, or for example, today the financial sector is becoming much more important than before. And how? So then.
We have Kirk online. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, sorry, I can barely hear what everybody's saying except Jonas. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good, Jonas. Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation, and I, like you, have gone through lots of these presentations before, in our careers. But one thing I was wondering, one thing that struck me was the slide you showed with the periodization of within and between growth, right?
Yeah.
So what I would generally think is, how sensitive are these rates to how the periods were chosen? So the question is were these periods chosen to cherry pick because it fit well, or why were these periods chosen exactly? That's a question I think that most people would ask immediately.
Yeah, they are. Lennart didn't discuss this, but in Carl Axel Nilsson and Ole Krantz, in a paper in the 70s, discuss this periodization, and they have arguments for it. And then it has been more or less routinely, by routine, applied in Schön's book. I dwelled a little into the periodization when I studied the price history, and I experimentized with changing the periods, and I've got the same wave pattern, but I cannot say what would happen with this productivity figures. I think there is reason to return to this issue of productivity change. No, also because we have the more recent period, which was not covered by Lennart, as well as the problem you point to, and actually Lars Herlitz also points to the need for discussion of the structural limits. Okay.
Seems like maybe there is no more question, so that would lead us to finish it right on time. Thank you so much. It was a really interesting presentation, and I think it's a good archive to have at the department also. So this will all be online like the others, and the next presentation is on the 3rd of October, and it might only be online. If the presenter is online, we can still gather in the room, but yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you.